The next speaker is Waziyatawin. She's a Dakota writer and teacher and activist committed to the liberation of Indigenous peoples and homelands. She's the author or co-editor of 5 volumes, including For Indigenous Eyes Only, a Decolonization Handbook, and What Does Justice Look Like? The Struggle for Liberation in Dakota Homeland. Her current research interests include the topics of Indigenous women and resistance, how to theorize and practice decolonizing strategies of resistance and resurgence, and Indigenous peoples and global collapse. So here's Waziyatawin. Ready? So the first question. Sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
That's right. Hello, my relatives. It's with a good heart that I greet all of you with a handshake. I am Waziyatawin, and I'm a Dakota woman from the place we call Pejihudazizik Abimakoche, or land where they dig for yellow medicine. And in English, that place is known as the Upper Sioux Reservation, and it's located in southwestern Minnesota. I also, before we get into the questions, I just want to make a couple of acknowledgments too. The first is that, like Derek mentioned earlier, we are on Ohlone territory, and in any discussion about the land and about life, I think that it is so important to make that recognition, that so this university could be here, so this city could be here, Indigenous life had to suffer. Indigenous life was exterminated. Indigenous peoples were dispossessed. And we have to keep that at the forefront of our minds in all of these discussions. The other point I want to make, or just say to all of you, is that today, November 13th, 2011, is the 149th commemoration of the forced march of Dakota women and children in 1862. And in other years, we've had commemorative walks to honor and remember the suffering of Dakota women who were forced marched in November of 1862, about 150 miles over 7 days. And if you know anything about Minnesota, you probably know that it's cold and that it was a time of suffering for my people, especially for the grandmothers, for the children who were on that forced march. And it was 149 years ago today that my grandmothers arrived at Fort Snelling, which is a concentration camp site where people were held in the winter of 1862 and 63. And that forced removal was part of Minnesota's campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing against our people. And so I know this time of year always weighs heavy on the minds of Dakota people, Lakota people. We also have Wounded Knee in December, and we have the mass hanging of Dakota warriors, which occurred on December 26, 1862. So this is a difficult time for our people, and I have that in my mind as I talk today.
You've written about the dangers of abstraction of the enemy, or to whatever it is we find ourselves in resistance. Could you explain what you mean by this and how it relates to the struggle to defend the land?
In June of this year, I had the opportunity to travel to Palestine. And it was a quite amazing experience for me. I traveled with a delegation of women of color, activists and scholars. And really it was an opportunity for us to understand the experience of Palestinians, and for me as an Indigenous woman to make connections with other people who are experiencing settler colonialism. So it was a powerful trip. And I just, before I go on to that, I just want to say that this was the concentration camp site where Dakota ancestors were kept in the winter of 1862 and 63. Yeah. So when I was in Palestine, there were very real, kind of concrete aspects of colonization that were underway, that Israeli expansion is still in a frenzy at the moment as we speak. And so Israeli settlements are still being built. Colonizers are moving into Palestinian lands. They're occupying Palestinian homes. And for me, it was a very strange experience, kind of seeing how a population suffers what my ancestors suffered. And it's not to say that we aren't still in the active phase of colonialism in the United States context, because certainly the United States government and corporations are still encroaching on indigenous lands, still exploiting indigenous resources, and I'll get to another example later about ongoing genocide in today's context. But the heyday of expansionist frenzy in the United States has passed. And so going to Palestine, it was a very different experience seeing it underway. And so, you know, just to give one example, when we first traveled into the West Bank and we went to the village of Awarta, and the people there had just experienced 45 days of terror there, in which Israeli military were coming into their homes, brandishing guns before their children, their families. They were abducting people. They had gone on a campaign of abduction of Palestinian women. 100 women had been abducted that spring. Just 2 hours before we arrived that day, settlers had gone in and they were burning their wheat crop. And this was a clear attack on food production and a food source for the people, which is intended to starve a population, a civilian population. And they also took us to a hilltop where we could observe the expansion underway. And they talked about how in various stages the process of colonization was underway. So first, the settlers would come, they would start building, oftentimes with temporary structures, and then the permanent structures would replace the temporary structures, and you would start to see they weren't going anywhere. Not only were they not going anywhere, they were going to be expanding, and more people were going to be coming. And it was really heartbreaking for me, in part because I kept seeing flashbacks to the experiences of Dakota people. It's exactly the same kind of process that happened with our people. In that context, it was very clear who the enemies were. And so Palestinians could recognize Israeli soldiers coming into their homes brandishing guns as enemies. They could recognize settlers burning their wheat crop as enemies. They could recognize soldiers kidnapping or abducting their women and torturing them as enemies. They could recognize settlers constantly encroaching on Palestinian land as enemies. But there were also abstractions that I saw while I was there, and it was when I made connections to the abstractions that I became increasingly concerned about the capacity for resistance. And so this builds on a point that Eric was making about the capacity to recognize who the enemy is, because how do you engage in resistance if you can't identify the enemy? So one example in Palestine, well, first of all, there was excessive barbed wire everywhere, security cameras, checkpoints, security towers, that constant surveillance, the apartheid wall, these major atrocities, really. And so when I talk about abstraction, I'm not saying that they aren't concrete or physical structures. What I'm saying is that if we assume that oppression is carried out by people, not by objects, that the perpetrators of oppression, that is, the people who have created those abstractions, are disguised, they're masked, they're harder to identify. And we have a very similar kind of process that has occurred in the United States context for Indigenous peoples. So at one time, my Dakota ancestors, when they experienced invaders coming into our land, the enemy had a face. The face was in the form of early explorers who were interested in scouting out how they might subdue a particular region or how they might exploit a particular region. It took the form of fur traders who came in and who engaged in a form of economic imperialism, drawing our people into a market economy that was going to be a form of exploitation of ourselves and the environment. It took the form of missionaries who engaged in religious imperialism and attempted to convert our people and eradicate all aspects of our traditional way of life. It took the form of soldiers who built places like Fort Snelling, soldiers who were there with the purpose of subjugating our population, subjugating Indigenous life and land, and also making the way for settlers to come in droves. So when my ancestors went to war in 1862, they did so against a recognizable enemy. Since that time, as the United States government worked to maintain our subjugation, policies were put into place. There were institutions that were put into place. And in that context, in the last 150, 200 years, it's been much more difficult for Dakota people to recognize who the enemy is. And so when I talk about an abstraction of the enemy, that's what I mean.
So, I'm a little bit confused. Can you be more clear about who the enemy is then? Or is that part of the problem?
I think that's part of the problem, right. Because I would say that it's not, in Palestine, the apartheid wall is obviously this oppressive structure that's on the landscape, but the wall itself is not the enemy, right? I think the perpetrators, the people who built the wall, the people who are benefiting from the installation of the wall, they are the enemies in that context. But it's harder to fight.
I'm thinking about something that I've thought about for quite a while, and let me know if this relates to what you're talking about, that it seems pretty clear to me that it is not the job of a member of an oppressed class to differentiate among members of the oppressor class as to who is the enemy. It's members of the oppressor class to differentiate ourselves from others of the oppressor class. So it's not a woman's job to figure out whether I, as a man, am a member of the patriarchal rape culture. It's my job to differentiate myself from other men. And I thought about this one day when I was thinking about, I was just sort of fantasizing about, okay, so let's say I went over to Iraq to say, hey, I'm not an invader, I want to help. It's like, it wouldn't be up to them to figure out whether I am somebody from an NGO, right, or it would be up to me to differentiate myself. Does this apply?
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely true. But as Indigenous people, for example, here under colonialism, I think that we, for our own benefit, for our own strides toward liberation, that we have to be able to understand who the enemy is and what it is we're resisting. And I think that the danger of the abstraction is that it becomes normalized, it becomes natural, it becomes perceived as permanent, and as inevitable, okay? And I think the United States government is a perfect example, because most Indigenous people living in the United States today have now come to accept the United States government as a permanent entity, right? An entity that will always be there, and that it is pointless to fight because we can't fight against it.
Kind of like people perceive civilization too.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so what does resistance and defense of the land look like for Indigenous people today? And is this different, or how is it different than resistance in the past?
Well, I think that this abstraction changes the nature of resistance, and it does so because we end up subjugating, I think, our own capacity for resistance. That it becomes internalized, it becomes normalized. And for Dakota people, we had a very brutal subjugation. We had, after our war, we were defeated. There was, policies of genocide, ethnic cleansing. Our people were forced out of our homeland. Our treaties were abrogated. Bounties were placed on our scalps. We had mass hanging, and it made it virtually impossible for our people to maintain a militant resistance. And in that context, then when policies of colonization were put into place, things like boarding schools, the Dawes Allotment Act, which divided up our existing reservations, and then really was intended to break up our communal societies, it was harder to fight back. What do you fight in that context? And so over the years, people end up engaging in court battles, in court struggles, or lobbying Congress for less oppressive laws or more Indigenous-friendly laws. And none of those actions are intended to actually create our liberation. They're intended to improve our position slightly in relation to the colonial state. Okay. So I think that we have, in many ways, found or created what are more distorted relationships with our land base or with the other beings in our land base. And I just want to give you a few examples of this. Because I teach at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island, it's given me an opportunity to get to know West Coast folks, and I've developed some really good friendships with some people, and it's allowed me to hear about their stories and about their struggles within their lands. And so one of my friends, Anthony Fernandez, who's Lower Elwha Nixglam from the west coast of what is now Washington State, has provided, I think, what is one of the most honest and poignant comments on the failure of Indigenous peoples to fulfill obligations that we once took very seriously. And he talks about Nixglam relationship with the Salmon people, and how in the beginning there was this agreement between the Salmon people and Nixglam people. And the salmon would give its life, and in return they would honor the salmon, they would keep the environment safe for the salmon so the salmon could continuously return. And when he talks about how that is changed under colonization, he talks about the building of the Elwha River Dam, which is one of the largest dam projects in the United States. And when it was built, they found loopholes, and so they didn't build the salmon ladders to allow the salmon to move upriver. And he talks about how that created changes with their relationship to the salmon. And this is just some comments from him. He said, when they started building in 1910 and finally finished in 1934, our elders told stories about how the water used to be red, because the salmon would come up and there would be the spawning salmon, and their bellies would be red from all of the eggs inside of their stomachs to be able to return. But then they started seeing a different red after this dam was built. And what it was a salmon trying to fulfill their obligation to us, bashing their heads against the dam. They would kill themselves trying to fulfill their obligations to us. Our obligation to them would have been to try to tear down the dam. That would be our obligation according to the original agreement. We forgot our original agreement. They keep their agreements. Every single being in our area has kept their agreement. We're the only ones who have turned away from our agreement. And I think that the same thing applies to Dakota people, for example. You know, we're also a buffalo people, but what does it mean to be a buffalo people when the buffalo were largely exterminated, when we can't fulfill our obligations and responsibilities to the other beings who occupied our homeland? And so here we are in the 21st century, and we've got these major problems, and the colonial relationship has meant that we don't interact with the other beings within our homelands in the same way, and it's that part is pretty frightening. So I think it also points to the problem with the slowness of the transition that occurs, and this is part of the normalization process. That it's one thing when you have people coming into your homeland and they have guns and they're threatening your life, they're threatening the life of your family. But what happens when they slowly take on a major construction project and take over your lands a little bit at a time? When do you intervene? When do you stop? If a dam is constructed, you know, how do you take it down? And you know, it's a complex process, and it becomes much more difficult to challenge if it's not addressed right at the very beginning.
It seems to me that that's also one of the this diffusion of who is the enemy, or this abstraction, is also part and parcel of what the dominant culture does in terms of what is a corporation. A corporation is an entity specifically organized to diffuse responsibility.
Right.
And you know, if Tony Hayward individually is going to come in and try to personally kill people in the Gulf of Mexico, like I said early on, he's a terrorist. But it's who's responsible when you have a limited liability corporation and you have, you know, a CEO, but that's just a job. And I mean, I'm thinking about Adolf Eichmann, and he just ran a railroad, and he was one of the architects of the Holocaust, and he was just doing his job, you know, basically making the railroads run on time to the death camps. And it doesn't really matter whether they were delivering potatoes or tons of fish or thousands of human beings, that it was, he's still, or I've read that the head of Auschwitz was a nice father. And, oh, who was it? Was it Himmler who fainted when he actually saw, yeah, Himmler fainted when he actually saw people getting killed face to face.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that any of those three people are not tremendously evil, but this is what a bureaucracy does.
Right.
And when you have an entire bureaucratic state, it ends up becoming, and this acts in the favor of the oppressor, because once again, if you have settlers coming into Dakota land, it's really obvious. You stop the settlers, you kill the settlers, you kill the soldiers, whatever. But you have this corporation that then comes in and hires Dakota people to
exactly.
build a road or to build a mine or whatever. And it's, oh, there was a word that came to me, but it's gone. Insidious.
It is. It's very insidious, and we become complicit, I think. Speaking of Hayward, one of the things I wanted to share with you today too is that after the British petroleum oil spill in the Gulf in 2010, Arvo Lookinghorse, who is the 19th generation keeper of the white buffalo calf pipe, sent out a message, an urgent call, and I just want to share some aspects of that and then talk a little bit about that. And he sent out this call to world religious and spiritual leaders, and he says, he identifies what the problem is, and he's asking for people to come together and offer prayers. He says, "We from the heart of Turtle Island have a great message for the world. We are guided to speak from all the white animals showing their sacred color, which have been signs for us to pray for the sacred life of all things. As I am sending this message to you, many animal nations are being threatened, those that swim, those that crawl, those that fly, and the plant nations. Eventually, all will be affected from the oil disaster in the Gulf. The dangers we are faced with at this time are not of spirit. The catastrophe that has happened with the oil spill, which looks like the bleeding of Grandmother Earth, is made by human mistakes, mistakes that we cannot afford to continue to make. I ask the spiritual leaders that we join together, united in prayer with the whole of our global communities. My concern is these serious issues will continue to worsen as a domino effect that our ancestors have warned us in their prophecies. I know in my heart there are millions of people that feel our united prayers for the sake of our Grandmother Earth are long overdue. I believe we as spiritual people must gather ourselves and focus our thoughts and prayers to allow the healing of the many wounds that have been inflicted on the earth. As we honor the cycle of life, let us call for prayer circles globally to assist in healing Grandmother Earth. We ask for prayers that the oil spill, this bleeding, will stop, that the winds stay calm to assist in the work. Pray for the people to be guided in repairing this mistake, and that we may also seek to live in harmony as we make the choice to change the destructive path we are on." And when I read those words, and this is the kind of message I think that we hear a lot in Indigenous communities in response to especially the damage, the destruction to our homelands, and that's that the spiritual path, the righteous path, is that we pray, we send good wishes, we unite in good thoughts, and that in doing so, it will affect change. And, I'm, as a Dakota person, I value prayer, and I value the power of prayer, but I also know that prayer alone is not going to stop the destruction. And I think that this kind of thing demonstrates the work that we need to do within Indigenous communities in terms of building a culture of resistance, because, he prays for repair work so that the bleeding will stop, so that the oil spill will stop, and that's good, but it doesn't address the crux of the problem. It doesn't stop BP oil. It doesn't. It's like a Band-Aid, and I would hope that as Indigenous peoples, that some of our spiritual leaders will start coming forward to pray for the resistance, the kind of actions that people will need to take to help actually attack infrastructure and reduce the harm that corporations like BP continue to perpetrate. And I say a few more things? Okay, so I want to give another example, and this is more of a. I thought you would appreciate this one. This is an excerpt from a speech that Oren Lyons gave in 2007 to the economic leaders of the United Nations, and he's talking to them about where things are headed and kind of their different responses. And he said, I said, "Now as you're coming down the final stretch, you're racing toward the finish. There's the stone wall, and you're not pulling your horse. You're not stopping. You are, in fact, accelerating." I said, "That's the way I see the use of what you call resources. You are using them faster than they are reproducing. You're headed toward that disaster, and none of you are pulling your horse. Yellow flags, CEO. If you don't have a moral question in your governing process, you don't have a process that's going to survive. That's the governing law, the moral question. You must have a moral society or you won't have any. Look, someone said to him, "You're an Indian, and we keep hearing about Indian prophecies. Can you give us the prophecy? Can you tell us the prophecy?" And he says, "Of course." I told them a lot because I know a lot, but at that particular moment, I said, "Certainly I can. And I can guarantee it." And the man said, "Really? What is it?" And Oren told him, "Next year you'll meet and nothing will have changed." We're moving in a very direct line to that stone wall. I do not believe personally that we passed the line or the point of no return, but we are approaching it. We are approaching it. And every day that you don't do what's right is a day that you've lost an option. You are losing your options every day. Right? So the question, I think, in this context is, what is right? What's the right action? And I think our actions definitely need to go beyond prayer. We need to begin to resume our role as the first defenders of the land.
I have two questions. I have two questions about that, but I'm going to say both questions, and you can do whatever you want with them.
Okay.
The first question is, I guess this is what you've been talking about, but how did the Dakota go from being part of the group that had the uprising in 1862 and fought with Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull? I'm thinking about what you told me that time about how you were talking about armed resistance or militant resistance, and some people got upset at you, and you mentioned that 150 years ago, whenever you leave your village, Dakota people would be armed, and now that's not acceptable. So how did that transformation from militant resistance to prayer as the only option really take place? And then the second question, well, I'll go with that one, and the second question is in a second.
Okay. Well, what I would say is that...
And this is not to blame the Dakota.
Oh, right. No, I mean, it's the brutality of the colonization of when we went to war and we were defeated, the consequences of going to war were so severe. We lost everything. We lost our homeland. We lost a lot of our population. What happened is that our people started to blame the resistors for the circumstances. So when our people were kept at Crow Creek in a reservation that began as a concentration camp, they blamed Dakota men who went to war, who used violence. And it's not a logical argument. It's not a rational argument. And one of the reasons we know it's not a logical argument or valid argument is that the Ho-Chunk people were forcibly removed with us, even though they took no part in the war. And so they had a land base in southern Minnesota, and in 1863 they were sent to Crow Creek with our people. And that was about a land grab. It was about wanting the land that the Ho-Chunk people had within Minnesota. And so if it were merely a matter of punishment for our audacity in striking back against the United States government and its citizens, the Ho-Chunk would have been left alone, but that wasn't the case. And so it was really about eradicating indigenous presence in Minnesota so white settlers could continue occupying without fear of violent repercussions against them anymore.
So the process of colonization is really similar to the process of training that a prostituted woman goes through by a pimp, that she's beaten into submission, or that an abused woman or any abuse victim. And a lot of times what you want to do, or any prisoner really, all you want to do is to make sure that the eye of the abuser doesn't come on you.
Right.
And one of the ways that you can try to keep the eye of the abuser off of you is by being as good as possible. And of course, it's never going to be good enough, and they're going to take what they want anyway. But there's that thought, if I can just make sure that they, if I can just follow along with, this reminds me of I don't remember which account this was in of the Holocaust that I read, but it was, the person was talking about how one of the things that the Germans would do is they would create sort of, I think they called them brain busters or something, where they would give people different color ID cards. And so everybody's trying to figure out, are the green ID cards or the red ID cards better?
Right, the good ones, yeah.
And it ends up, it mattered not at all. Is it better if I say that I'm a tinker or a shoemaker? It doesn't matter. But they've got all these options that if you can try to just negotiate it. And it also reminds me of something that Zygmunt Bauman said about how at every step in the Holocaust, the capital H Holocaust, which really bothers me, this is called the Holocaust when there's so many ongoing Holocausts, but in the capital H Holocaust, at every step of the way, it was in the Jews' rational best interest to not resist. So do you want to get an ID card, or do you want to resist and possibly get killed? Do you want to move to a ghetto? Do you want to resist and possibly get killed? Do you want to get on a cattle car? Do you want to resist and possibly get killed? Do you want to take a shower? Or do you want to resist and possibly get killed? Every step of the way. So maybe that's part of it, is we have this dread. Second question is, you talked about Indigenous people resisting, and it's really fun to, when you have militant Indigenous people, sometimes there are some layers of denial that you don't have to break through, that you sometimes have to break through with some other people. And I remember at a talk I gave one time, you were in the audience, and somebody in the audience said that she really wants the dams to come down, but she's afraid to do it because she could get killed. And I remember looking at your face, and you were getting pretty angry. And this is all sort of a long preamble to Indigenous people have been on the front lines of, and continue to be on the front lines of resisting colonization, civilization, etc. And in some ways, there are warrior societies that are ready, and they have that connection to the salmon or the bison that a lot of us have forgotten. But at the same time, it's really, and we as white people need to take our lead from Indigenous peoples in any of these struggles. But at the same time, it's really crucial that we as people of privilege not continue to put the poor and to put the Indigenous on the front lines yet again. So can you take that wherever you want to take it?
I totally agree. You know, and that's the fear. That's always the fear for Indigenous populations, is that, you know, we have a different relationship with our homelands, and our teachings mean that we're required, we're supposed to be acting in a particular way. And I think many of us, especially in the United States context, have moved away from those original instructions, from those obligations, and we still have the teachings, we still have the values, but it's been virtually impossible to put those into practice and to live those on a daily basis. You know, in Dakota homeland, you know, we have about 0.012% of our original land base. That's like 12,000ths of 1% of our original land base. And, you know, I often say that if our people had to live on our current land base, we would starve within a matter of days. Most of the land in my home community is floodplain or bluff. And, you know, we don't, you know, we can't eat the fish in the river. The bison population, you know, was wiped out. The elk population was wiped out. We have a limited number of deer. I mean, it's a very different existence right now. At the same time, our homelands are beloved to us, and we're going to need to take actions. We're going to need to take better care of our homelands, and that means putting our lives at risk. And I know I get angry, I get irritated, I get really upset by settler populations never wanting to risk anything. And I think, too, that people are looking for the safest route. I mean, all of us should be looking for the safest route. But people who don't want to take more militant action, you know, if you think that you're going to be safe, if you're providing food from your gardens to support the revolution, you're still going to be targeted. You know, once there is effective action, once there is a threat to the state, anyone who supports the revolution in any way will be subject to imprisonment, torture, death. That's going to be the reality. So everyone needs to work up whatever courage they need to take action.
And in fact, the point of the above ground is to attract attention. So as things become increasingly repressive, the people in the above ground are in some ways in greater danger than the people below ground because we're already identified. They got big bullseyes on their chests. That's their job. That's our job.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I have two questions left. One of them is, or maybe three. One of them is, what could you, or what do you, as an individual Dakota person, so I'm not asking you to speak for anybody but yourself, but what do you want? I mean, the majority of the people here are white. What do you want from white allies?
I want you to defend Indigenous homelands. I want you to support Indigenous life. And I don't mean just the plants and the animals and the waters and the topsoil. I mean the people who also belong to the land. I don't want to feel like a trespasser in my homeland anymore.
So how can or are Indigenous peoples working to overcome the obstacles you've talked about, and where do you draw your inspiration?
Well, I want to say something about some of the obstacles right now, because I start to think that even I get caught up in thinking that we're in a different place than we really are. And this hit home with me a few weeks ago when I was listening to an NPR expose on the foster care system in the state of South Dakota. And Dakota, Lakota people, and I think Indigenous people throughout the United States know that there are problems with our children still being taken away, still being taken out of our homes, and mostly sent into white homes. And in our communities, there are all kinds of stories about bad experiences with social workers, with the social welfare system, with the court system, over custody issues and things like that. And I knew that there was an issue that one Dakota woman named Janice Howe from the Crow Creek Reservation was struggling with, and she would keep me updated a little bit on what was happening with her grandkids who had been taken away. And she was one of the people featured in this NPR expose. And through the report, it was clear that genocide is ongoing in the 21st century, that according to the UN Convention on the Crime and Punishment or Prevention of Genocide, one of the criteria that constitutes genocide by international standards is the forcible removal of the children, or removing the children from one population to another. And that's still happening right now in 2011, in the 21st century. In the state of South Dakota, Indigenous children represent about 15% of the population, but are over 50% of the children who are put into foster and adoptive care. And when the state of South Dakota sends these kids into foster homes. They get paid. They get paid by the federal government. And South Dakota, which is a poor state, gets paid to the tune of $100 million a year for the children that they put into foster care. So the state of South Dakota, a decade ago, designated that all Native American children are special needs, which means Native American children who are permanently removed from their homes are actually worth more financially to the state than any other children, and certainly more than white children. And then they get bonus money if the kids get adopted. The state receives money if they move kids out of foster care and into adoption, $4,000 per child. And according to the federal records, if the child has special needs, then they get $12,000. And this becomes a way for the state to bring money into their economy, which means that in the 21st century, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota children are being taken out of their homes to bring in money to the state. And this is a really hideous form of colonial exploitation. So even now, our children are being used by the state to make money. It's really sick. And then I wonder, what's happening with our culture of resistance? Why, what's going on? And I want to just say something about Janice Howe, because she's been fearlessly and courageously telling the truth about her experience, and I think that it will lead to some kind of change. And I think that the role that she's played really needs to be celebrated. But it speaks to the insidious nature of colonization. 200 years ago, if white people came into our homes and tried to take our children away, they would be killed. What does it mean that in the 21st century these kinds of crimes are being perpetrated and our population feels so helpless, so powerless to challenge it? Right? So my work, and I think that a lot of the work of like-minded Dakota people and Indigenous people, is about trying to create a culture of resistance and to exert our own humanity to say that these things are not right, that we should not tolerate them, and that we will feel better about ourselves and about our own humanity if we exert our humanity more forcefully. Okay. Jack Forbes talks about how the desire for justice gets blunted. He says the material prosperity within successful imperialistic societies, especially for middle-class and upper-class citizens, unfortunately serves to not only hide internal decay, but also to blunt people's desires for truth, justice, and personal authenticity. Even when obvious examples of wrongdoing appear, or evidence of unspeakable atrocities, the bulk of the citizenry will refuse to take any action, in some cases because of a fear of reprisal, but more commonly because of a desire to continue to enjoy the prosperity without being disturbed. And when I think about most Indigenous populations in the United States context, that there's this struggle for basic survival, but there's also the same kind of, I think mass media, the kind of numbness that sets in, or entertainment industry that is intended to keep us hypnotized, that we're all part of that. And so part of the job is breaking through that as well.
So before we come back to the question of drawing your inspiration, I mentioned earlier that so many Indigenous people have said to me that the first thing that we have to do is to decolonize ourselves, to decolonize our hearts or minds. And you've written about that a little bit. And so can you talk about what it means to decolonize?
Right. My colleague, friend, adopted brother, Michael Yellowbird, and I have done some writing on the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples. And, part of, and again, I'm back to this idea of abstraction, because colonial oppression has become so naturalized, so normalized, that a lot of it is unrecognizable to many of our own people. And, and I still experience that. I think that part of my response to the trip to Palestine was because when you see oppression in another context, it's easier to recognize sometimes than when it's in your own life, or when you've grown up with it and it's not even visible to you anymore. So part of the decolonization of the mind is really about understanding how we have been impacted by colonization, how colonization continues to impact our lives on a daily basis through institutions, systems, relations of power, and then working to challenge those and undo the damage.
So, once again now, how can or are Indigenous people working to overcome the obstacles you've talked about, and what are your own inspirations?
I think that part of it is, right now, a lot of it is awareness. First of all, there are 370 million Indigenous peoples around the world who are still practicing what might be called sustainable, or at least carbon neutral lives. I would say that that's not the case with those of us living in the United States or Canada. I think that most of us have been impacted enough by the society that we are part of it. We participate in it. For me, for my community, I think what we're trying to do is, first of all, become aware of the extent of destruction within our homelands. And it doesn't take much. I mean, we just have to kind of look around and think about how our land bases have been affected. So in Dakota homeland, we've had 90% of our wetlands destroyed, 98% of the big woods, 98% of the white pines in northern Minnesota, and 99% of our prairies destroyed in the last, roughly 150 years. Every year we have about 90 million pounds of pesticides dumped on soybean crops, another 50 million pounds dropped on corn crops. We also have companies like Monsanto with patented genetically modified seeds that make even growing our traditional corn troubling within our homeland, problematic. I live along the Minnesota River Valley, and at the headwaters of the Minnesota River is Big Stone coal burning power plant, which dumps all kinds of toxins into the Minnesota River, and a lot of the sediment ends up settling right where my home reservation is. So, all of our, even if we wanted to engage in our traditional subsistence activities, it would be virtually impossible within our homeland today. We don't, like I said, we would starve if we had to rely strictly on what's available on our current land base. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of understanding how we've been impacted, and then we need to think about what our original instructions are, what it means for us to be Dakota within Dakota homeland, or for any other Indigenous nation to be Indigenous within their homelands. It means restoring the relationships that once existed and becoming the defenders of the land to ensure the integrity for future generations. Some of the pictures, or one of the pictures that was just up, was of Tom Poorbear, who's Vice President of the Ogallala Lakota Nation. And at the end of October, when Obama was speaking there, he interrupted Obama's speech. and he was talking about the tar sands and the pipelines and stopping the pipelines, and Obama was forced to address his concerns, and then he moved on with his speech. But I want to share some statements from Tom Poorbear, because what I realized when I heard what happened in Denver, how unusual it is for many United States Indigenous leaders to even speak up about these issues. And in many ways it suggests how far we have to go. But he says, I feel that the United States of America should fulfill their obligation to the treaty tribes of the territory of the 1851 and 1868 Fort Laramie treaties, and also their obligation to us as the true owners of this territory. He says, we ask all Indigenous people to join us in our plight to oppose the Trans-Canada Keystone XL pipeline. We feel that Obama, in his position as President of the United States, should look at the issue very seriously, because he also purports to represent us as Indigenous peoples. So we are asking all Indigenous peoples and treaty nations, as well as other peoples who also respect our mother, the earth, to join our opposition to stop the Trans-Canada Keystone XL pipeline. Through a unified effort, we'll accomplish this task. As our great leader of our ancestral days, Crazy Horse, once said, you cannot sell the land your people are buried on. I believe today he would say, you cannot desecrate the land your people are buried on. And then in another context, Tom Poorbear said, I want the voice of the Oglala Sioux to be heard. I will put my body on the line if necessary. We need to hear more of that. And I want to give one more example, and this is of Indigenous women in Canada, women from the Blood Nation who recently got arrested for standing in front of an oil tanker as they were trying to prevent fracking development in their homelands, Blood Nation of Alberta, Canada. And one of the women who got arrested is Maya Tailfeathers, and upon her arrest, she really had some beautiful words to say in a statement, and I guess that's kind of what I want to close with today. Okay, Tailfeathers said in her statement, I do not feel as though what we did was heroic. We were a handful of people, including a couple of children, who gathered for a common purpose, to prevent any further desecration of the land. For us, this place is more than just land. It is the place that has given life to our people since time immemorial. Our culture, our language, our identity comes from the land, and it is to the land that we owe our very existence. This knowledge is something that our ancestors have passed on from the beginning. This land is our mother, and we must always respect that. So when I say that I do not feel that what we did was heroic, I mean that we were just doing the right thing. It is important to understand our actions were not rooted in politics, because this issue is more than just politics. It's about doing the right thing. I don't think in any of our hearts, and I mean the collective we, that there is any denying what the right thing to do is. The earth is all we have. It is just that simple. Without it, there is no us, and there is no we. We on the Blood Reserve have reached a point where we need to set aside politics and family ties and look at the very real issue at hand. We are about to kill the one thing that has given us life since the very beginning. How can we look our children and grandchildren in the eye and say that we have let such a thing happen? We are nothing without this place. There is no simple solution to the greater social issues that come as a result of colonization. However, there is a simple solution to this one problem, and that is just to do the right thing. Set aside your fears and protect what we have, the land, our mother.